Chapter 2 of The House on the Downs by Gladys Edson Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Moonflowers. Within less than half an hour, the ploughman came back from the village with Inspector Haskett and a couple of odd-looking constables. Murder in peaceful Downland was an unheard-of occurrence. The coroner had gone to Lewis on business and would not return until late in the evening, so Dr. Petherton, the elderly, overworked local practitioner, acting as his deputy, drove up to Rotherdene Hollow a few minutes later in his battered little motor car. After an examination of the body, he stated that the man had been killed by the thrust of a knife or dirk through the back of the neck, severing the jugular vein and the carotid artery. Death had probably ensued within a few minutes, and he should judge that the victim had been dead a little over an hour. Dr. Petherton directed that the body be removed to the mortuary as soon as Inspector Haskett had concluded his examination. The physician then drove away to complete his daily round of calls in the scattered Downs villages. Inspector Haskett made a thorough search of the dead man's clothing. From the inner breast pocket of the victim's smart coat, he drew a purse full of money, banknotes, gold, silver. In one of its compartments he found a platinum bracelet set with diamonds. The other pockets yielded up an immaculate handkerchief of finest linen, with the letter R embroidered in one corner, a handsome watch and chain, a gold cigarette case and matchbox with the monogram CR, and, most important find of all in Haskett's eyes, an embossed leather case containing visiting cards engraved with the name Mr. Craddock Rayner. That was all, no address or further information. "Craddock Rayner," the detective read aloud twice. "Any of you ever hear of this man? Did you, Mr. Brandon? Are you, Mr. Elphick?" Both shook their heads. Haskett frowned in puzzled fashion. "Well, I know I've heard the name before, and within a few days, too. But I can't place it. Of course you'll all have to give evidence at the coroner's court. You, Giles Bassett, and David Jenkins, as well as Mr. Brandon and Mr. Elphick. Notice of the date will be sent you later." The shepherd and the ploughman returned to their respective duties, but Mark and Mr. Elphick lingered in the hollow, watching while Inspector Haskett and his two subordinates searched under bush and vine for possible clues. "We've got to look for a deeper motive than robbery in this case," declared the inspector. "Some personal matter here, or the money and valuables would never have been left, especially that platinum bracelet. With the diamonds and all, it must be worth a small fortune." He stooped suddenly before a clump of blackthorns. On the ground, protruding an inch or so beyond the prickly branches, glinted a bit of steel. Inspector Haskett, with an air of triumph, held up to view a slender, blood-stained poniard with jeweled hilt. "This is the tiny little needle that did the job." "God save us!" ejaculated Mr. Elphick. "It can't have been done with that paper cutter." "How do you know it's a paper cutter, sir?" demanded Haskett quickly. Mr. Elphick's weak eyes blinked affrightedly. "It's the sort of thing one would be likely to use for a paper cutter. Shouldn't you say so, Mr. Brandon?" Mark declined to commit himself. "Have you ever seen this knife before, Mr. Elphick?" the inspector asked rather sternly. The little naturalist coughed nervously. "Certainly not, Haskett, most certainly not." "Sure you haven't any notion who it belongs to?" Mr. Elphick lost color again. He seemed unable to turn his eyes from the stained poniard to meet the inspector's gaze. "Bless me, Haskett, should I be likely to have any notion about the owner of such an object?" "No offense intended, sir," Haskett answered respectfully. "But in a murder case, we're in duty bound to ask all manner of questions, likely or not." "Quite so, Haskett, quite so. And now if you have no further questions, I think Mr. Brandon and I should be getting on to the Grange. Dinner is at 8, and we have a longish walk before us." As Mark and the little naturalist went away over the time-scented slopes of the Downs toward the red-tile roofs of Rotherdene Grange, Mr. Elphick appeared determined to banish the memory of the tragedy in the hollow, and discoursed learnedly, if somewhat tediously, on the various species of butterfly to be found in Downland. Mark's thoughts, however, harked back to the murdered man. "I am curious to know," he remarked when Mr. Elphick paused a second in his entomological lecture, "what Haskett will make of the two clues he has, the jeweled poniard and the moonflower in the dead man's hand." Mr. Elphick let the butterfly net trail over a patch of prickly heather. "Do you really consider the moonflower a clue, Mr. Brandon?" he queried, in an odd, repressed voice. "I'm inclined to. I couldn't say just why, but I have the impression we shall hear of that moonflower Mr. Rayner was clutching so tightly." The little naturalist shook his head dubiously. "It's a sad case any way you look at it. Now I wonder if it would not be well to say nothing about it at the Grange until after dinner. Of course it would disturb Sir Quentin, occurring so near by." "That's a good suggestion, Mr. Elphick. We will say nothing about it until after dinner. It would be no end upsetting to Sir Quentin's young wife, too." "Just so," agreed the little naturalist. "It would be quite likely to upset Lady Eve Rotherdene." Mark looked at him. He fancied there had been a peculiar intonation in his voice, but Mr. Elphick's mild, faded eyes blinked up at him guilelessly. "I understand that Lady Eve Rotherdene is very beautiful and very charming," observed Mark for the sake of saying something. Mr. Elphick settled his spectacles with precision. "Sir Quentin idolizes her," he said, and turned the conversation to butterflies again. Soon they neared Rotherdene Grange, a low, rambling, Jacobean building isolated at the foot of the sheltering downs, and ringed on the east by a fine park of beechwoods. Mark received a warm welcome from Sir Quentin, whom he found to be a handsome, well-preserved man of scholarly appearance, his dark brown hair and short, square-cut mustache still untouched by the silvering process of years. The other members of the household were dressing. Lady Eve was giving a dinner party that night. When Mark had changed into evening clothes, he descended to the drawing-room with a sense of expectancy. As a matter of fact, he was eager to meet Sir Quentin's young wife. He fancied that if Lady Eve Rotherdene had inherited the nature of her gay rake of a father, of whom he had heard much in his boyhood days, she might find life at the Grange, married as she was to a scholarly, somewhat self-contained man of near middle age, rather dull. Then, too, there were Sir Quentin's gypsy wards, grown by now to manhood and womanhood. How would an earl's daughter hit it off in close daily communication with these two gypsies? The drawing-room, lighted by two big silver candelabra, was a long, low-ceilinged apartment, with cozy armchairs, a cheerful carpet, and an open grate faced with dull blue tiles. Sir Quentin, the only occupant of the room, was standing on the hearth-rug, smoking. "The ladies will be done directly, Mark, old boy," he said. "I confess I am anxious to present you to them both. My wife and my former ward, Fenzetta Lee." "And I am tremendously anxious to meet Lady Eve Rotherdene, and the little gypsy girl, too," Mark responded. Sir Quentin smiled. "The little gypsy girl is a fine, cultured young woman now. I'm proud of Fenzetta Lee. The boy, too, is a credit to his training. He has a future before him as a violinist. He is already in concert work." They heard footsteps outside. The door was opened, and Lady Eve and Fenzetta Lee entered. Mark thought he had never seen two women as lovely, nor of more distinctly opposite types. Lady Eve was an exquisite blonde, of slim and girlish figure, with flower-fine skin, eyes the color of Italian skies, and hair like spun gold. She wore a frock of pale blue satin, cut rather daringly low. About her white neck hung a heavy rope of pearls, which reached almost to her knees. Fenzetta Lee was of the most perfect type of Roman beauty, tall and splendidly developed, with dark, lustrous eyes, Grecian features, and a crown of glossy black hair. Her dress of black silk crepe, caught at the side with a single red rosette, had the effect of being made in one piece, without seam or joining, and showed the noble curves of her breast and hips. Her tawny neck and throat were bare, save for a chain of red Phoenician beads. With something of a shock, Mark recognized in Fenzetta Lee the young woman whom he had seen on the downs, fleeing in horror from Rotherdene Hollow. He knew from the troubled light in her beautiful eyes that the recognition was mutual. Sir Quentin, observing nothing of all this, presented Mark to Lady Eve with an air of distinct pride. As Mark took the little jeweled hand Eve held out to him, he noted with astonishment akin to dismay that she was wearing a corsage bouquet of large, white-petaled flowers, moonflowers. End of chapter 2.